Hi there, everybody. So, we are doing another mystery. This one is called The Kidnapping of a Millionaire. Figure out the mystery. Who done it? Bum, bum, bum. I didn't put the noise in there that time, sorry. So, you're going to watch the video, collect the clues, and then submit your answer. We will reveal the answer after all classes have participated. All right, here we go. The Kidnapping of a Millionaire. So here it is. Pay attention. A mystery game. The Kidnapping of a Millionaire. Mr. Banks was a very wealthy and successful man. He owned a prosperous oil company and inherited millions from his family. Although Mr. Banks was successful, he had many enemies. Mr. Banks lived alone. He was never married and never had children. In fact, he didn't even like children. He was a grumpy old man who traveled the world and bought himself extravagant things. He had 7 sports cars, 3 mansions, and even a private island. You would think some of this man's wealth would donate generously, but not Mr. Banks. That's why on April 15th, it was no surprise when Mr. Banks was kidnapped. He had it coming, said the town's baker. Mr. Banks never left him a tip. Serves him right, said the local charity, who never saw a dime from old Mr. Banks. Regardless of his reputation, the local police had an important case to crack. Who done it? So, what you need to know here, Mr. Banks was kidnapped. The date of the kidnapping was April 15th. The police think that Mr. Banks didn't, well, know that Mr. Banks didn't drive, but he was driving himself to his golf tournament. They believe that's when he was kidnapped. Okay, so you have this Google Doc again. So you want to use this Google Doc, have it opened up, right, in order to fill it out while you are watching or listening to the video to collect evidence and clues, okay? So you could stop the video, type in information that you hear as we're going along, go back and restart the video to collect more information. So make sure you have this opened up in a tab, okay? Okay, here we go. The victim, Mr. Banks. So we're collecting some information about him right now. So again, make sure you have that Google Doc open so you can collect information about Mr. Banks first of all. When the police conducted interviews and collected evidence, this is what they found out about Mr. Banks, the victim. Mr. Banks lived on Strawberry Lane. Mr. Banks didn't know how to drive. On the morning of the disappearance, Mr. Banks told Janet that somebody called him and threatened to kill him if he didn't pay the person $1 million. Mr. Banks said that it was a male's voice and the voice was familiar. Mr. Banks was on his way to a golf tournament the morning he was kidnapped. He never arrived. Mr. Banks was a very wealthy and successful owner of an oil company, but had many enemies. Mr. Banks lived alone and didn't like children. Mr. Banks inherited millions from his family. Mr. Banks did not donate his money, but spent it on himself extravagantly. Okay, so pause the video, take some notes on Mr. Banks on your Google Doc, and then restart it when you're ready to move on. So now let's learn about the suspects. So collect your evidence. Don't forget to collect evidence and clues about the suspects. So here are the suspects: Janet Long, Sally Denman, the maid, Margaret Short, John Williams, and James Gall. Okay, so first and foremost is Janet Long. Don't forget to collect your evidence. When the police conducted interviews and collected evidence, this is what they found out about Janet Long. Janet Long is the only person who was friends with Mr. Banks. Mr. Banks told Janet that somebody called him and threatened to kill him if he didn't pay the person $1 million. Janet and John Williams were seen together at the local deli. They were having lunch together. Janet broke things off with John after she overheard him talking to Sally about a vacation they were planning. After the kidnapping, Janet told the police about the threatening call that had been made to Mr. Banks that morning. The police traced the call to a payphone on Lemon Lane. Janet was very fond of John Williams. They had recently started dating. Janet was in a meeting the morning of the kidnapping. Janet was the only person who was listed on Mr. Banks' will. She would inherit everything when he was gone. Any clues? Anything suspicious? Make sure you're jotting notes down. Anything that seems like it could be a clue on your Google Doc. Our second suspect is Sally Denman. When the police conducted interviews and collected evidence, this is what they found out about Sally Denman. Sally is Mr. Banks' maid. She was the last person to see Mr. Banks on the morning of the disappearance. Sally was underpaid and overworked. Sally told police that Mr. Banks wanted to drive himself to the golf tournament. The police thought that was odd because Mr. Banks didn't know how to drive. Sally and John Williams were best friends, maybe even more than that. They liked working together but hated working for Mr. Banks. They often joked about how they would steal his fortune. Again, make sure you're jotting down clues and evidence. Our third suspect is Margaret Short. So when the police conducted interviews and collected evidence, this is what they found out about Margaret Short. Margaret Short was Mr. Banks' accountant. She was the only person who had access to Mr. Banks' personal information. Margaret told Janet that Mr. Banks would lose a lot of money soon. Margaret met with Mr. Banks the night of April 14th to discuss his finances. And John Williams. When the police conducted interviews and collected evidence, this is what they found out about John Williams. John Williams was Mr. Banks' chauffeur. He drove Mr. Banks everywhere. In fact, Mr. Banks didn't even know how to drive. John and Janet Long were seen together at the local deli. They were having lunch. They had recently started dating. Janet broke things off with John after she overheard him talking to Sally about a vacation they were planning. John was underpaid and overworked. John told police that Mr. Banks gave him the morning off. John lived in a small apartment on Lemon Lane. John didn't have a cell phone. John and Sally were best friends, maybe even more than that. They liked working together but hated working for Mr. Banks. They often joked about how they would steal his fortune. So, are you finding anything suspicious? Make sure you are jotting down those notes on your Google Doc, those clues, and that evidence. And finally, James Gall. When the police conducted interviews and collected evidence, this is what they found out about James Gall. James Gall was Mr. Banks' rival. He despised Mr. Banks in every way. James was often heard making threats to Mr. Banks. He told Mr. Banks a week prior that he wished he would disappear. James's office building was located on the corner of Lemon Lane and Apple Avenue. James left on a business trip the night of April 14th. Evidence? Clues? So the police believe they found the kidnapper and brought him or her into headquarters under arrest. Do you know who it is? What's your guess and why? When the video stops, choose the person you think is guilty and then provide evidence to support your answer. Answers will be revealed, maybe not Friday. I don't know, when everybody, all 4 classes have gone through this. So before you guess, remember a few things. Remember the crime. Not all evidence that was collected was meaningful or pertinent to the case. Sometimes it's put in there to throw you off. Don't jump to conclusions. You can't arrest someone because you think they are guilty. There needs to be a justifiable reason that makes them seem guilty. Who has motive? For example, just because someone was acting strange doesn't mean they did anything. Maybe they're just strange. So you want to click on the link for your teacher to fill out the Google form to guess who is the kidnapper. Don't forget to write your explanation. All right, good luck, people. We will reveal who the kidnapper is and the explanations, like I said, after all the classes have gone through it. All right, good luck. Super sleuthing.